Hey guys, if you've seen any of my playthrough or cover videos, you know that I'm a huge fan of Positive Grid's Bias FX, both as a tool for practice and a tool for recording and just getting great DI guitars. As a result, I thought it would be a good idea to try and build some bias presets that actually match and mimic the sounds of my actual rig that I use when I play live, which is a guitar amp and a bass amp. For the guitar amp, it's a Peavy Valveking that has a Celestion Vintage 30 in it instead of just a basic crappy Valveking speakers, and an Ampeg PF500 that goes into a SWR Working Man's 2x10. So for this video, I'm going to be using an SM57 mic'd up on the speaker. I'll show you how I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to run that SM straight into a Focusrite Sapphire Pro 40, then into Pro Tools. So we're going to have a nice clean signal chain, and I'm not going to do any post-processing on the signals we record. And then we're going to see if we can get a decent or exact sounding bias FX tone. Then that'll of course be on the Tonecloud to download. So let's get started. Okay, so here's the Valveking, all mic'd up. Right now we got the SM57, a little bit between the edge of the speaker and the cone, just where I like to usually mic amps. We also have the two channels set up on the amp the way I like them, in this case kind of a clean channel that I'll use for jazzy stuff, and then of course the lead channel, which sounds great for all kinds of different metals. Then of course we have the microphone over here running directly in to the Focusrite, not going through the preamp, just bypassing that for the sake of this test. Alright, so here we are in Pro Tools. As you can see on these first two tracks here, we have the two figures we recorded earlier on the amplifier, and then here we have the two DIs. So I'm just going to play what I recorded on the amps real quickly to give you an idea of what we're working with. That's one figure. And this is the other. Little basic, progression there. And then for the distorted channel, we got some kind of chuggy add 2 chords. Alright, so then down here we have the DIs with our bias presets. So let me bring these up for you. I was super impressed at the clean tone. This one came out amazingly. I noticed the emulation of the speakers, in this case the 4x12 Celest V30, sounds almost identical to the actual vintage 30. And when I was playing around with combinations of amp models to use, I noticed that I could get them all pretty close just by running them through this vintage 30 emulator. And as you can see, we have our SM on both of these is positioned relatively, close, or how they're similar to how I have mine positioned. Then all I did was add a little bit of spring reverb, and I used that large transient you see here where I hit the strings to gauge how much reverb I needed, how much needed to be mixed in with the signal, and how long it needed to dwell. So now I'm going to play the original track, and it's going to run for a bit, and then when it jumps down to the orange track, you're going to hear the bias version. So let's give it a listen. And I thought that was awesome. It's super similar. Obviously, they don't have a V or a Valveking emulator within Bias, but I think I got pretty darn close to what that's supposed to sound like, so definitely impressed with that. It's really cool that a $70 or $200, if you have the real version or the full version, plugin can sound that good and can emulate a real amplifier that closely. I believed it, and I'd seen demos on YouTube, and I'd read about how great it is, but I kind of had to sit down and do it for myself to find out, and man, I'm impressed. So when it comes to the distorted sound, this is what I came up with. I used a combination of the Laney and the German Fire, and I put this drive out in front because on the Valveking, I'm actually using a more gain button that the amp has. So that's, kind of emulates what putting a drive in front of your amp would sound like. Then I had to EQ it pretty aggressively to scoop out a lot of the bassiness that comes in these emulations and also add some high-end fizz. So let's give it a listen.
As you can see, definitely not as close as that first one, but that could also be because I'm generally better at building clean tones than I am at building distorted tones. Overall though, really impressed with the plugin, and even though what I built doesn't exactly sound like the Valveking, it's still a cool tone. So now we're going to go back out to the room and we're going to mic up the bass amp and then do the same thing.
Alright, now that we're done with the Valveking, we're going to mic up my bass rig and see what kind of bias presets we can build from it. So, a little bit about this rig. This is an Ampeg PF500 amp head. Usually I do run this compressor a little bit, but for the sake of this demo, I'm not going to. We've got about gain at 12 o'clock, a little bit of a bass boost, and just a very slight mid-cut, and treble at 12 o'clock. And we'll have the volume, you know, somewhere in here, kind of like this 10 to 11, I don't know, 11:30 range, I guess. The cabinet is the SWR Workingman's 2x10, and I believe these are SWR speakers too, so we'll have to go a little creative and find what kind of cab simulation in bias matches best. Once again, I'm the mic when I do have the SM57 on it. I'm going to put that right here, pretty much where I put it on the Valveking. Now we're going to head over to the computer and see what we got.
Alright, so here we are in the computer. As you can see, I have the PF500, the signal from the SM57 sitting on this track, and then our bias FX patch, which we'll look at a little later. I've got a really basic riff playing here, you're going to see. And I'm just basically checkerboarding between the two, and to give you an idea of how the amp sounds and how its bias counterpart sounds. So now I'm going to play through this track and we'll hear the bias amp compared to the real amp. Alright, so I'm super happy with how that came out. Much happier than with the distorted Valveking channel. So, I'm going to show you a little bit about what I did to get that tone. So, I'm going to pull up Positive Grid Bias real quick, and I'll walk you through it. So, for the amp and cab model, I found that this 700 RB with the presence and treble rolled down significantly and with a bit of a mid boost worked the best. I tried the Ampeg model they had because I figured, you know, it's an Ampeg amp, it's probably going to sound really similar. But the Ampeg model they had a lot bigger, they seemed to have a huge mid scoop and a lot of bass, so it was really, you know, clinky in the high end and had a lot of subs, and that's really not what the PF500 through that cab sounded like, but this 700 RB sounded nice. And then one thing I did have to do was add this EQ out front to take off some of this 3.2K because the pick attacks, especially when it came to the section with the picking. Oh, if I didn't previously mention that, this riff was played with the fingers and this was with a pick. And this was to see how bias responded to the different type of attack. And I noticed that it varied a little. Like, it didn't sound the same evenly across the board. If possible, I would like to EQ this section independently of this section, but I figured, you know, because I'm just trying to make a patch that sounds like my amp, I figured I'd do it kind of the best of both worlds. So that's what this little cut was to do. Then over here on the equalizer, I again had to go through cutting out some of the frequencies above 4K, including a pretty large high shelf. And that's because I noticed kind of a dead sound, just a more muffled sound with the mic, whereas these digital amps definitely want to give you a lot of presence and pop in your tone. When it comes to cab simulation, I actually used the 210 cab with the SM57 mic'd similar to how I had it, and I was really impressed with how this sounded. Depending on what amp model you used, you could always get pretty close with the 210 cab. So even though I don't know what kind of speaker this is emulating, it sounded pretty similar. So I'm going to take all these patches and upload them to Tonecloud. And also I just wanted to say that obviously if you have bias amp, you can make more detailed emulations because you can change how the amps work. You can change out specific components. You can do a custom IR. You can do the frequency match. But I just wanted to do a video with the basic FX version, which many people have, and show that with a good ear and a little bit of time, you can craft amp match tones with it. So I hope you guys liked the video, and stay tuned for more stuff. Peace.